Hello and welcome back. Today we are starting our revision of Pompeii and we're looking specifically at the politics of Pompeii and Herculaneum. So what we're going to do is we're going to do this in two parts, okay? And this is a little introduction. We're just going to go over the basics of what these politics actually mean. And hopefully because we're doing it in two parts, it should stop this video from becoming about a half hour or an hour long. Keep it nice and simple. So, helps if I'm actually clicked on the PowerPoint and let's go. Okay, so what we should think about when looking at politics in these cities. So we often compare these cities to Rome and assume they are the same but on different scales. The same with their politics. Be careful when doing this, they are not the same. Now we've brought up this issue multiple times in the classroom and historians love to just go, oh yeah, it had the same political system as Rome. Of course, they were Roman cities, why wouldn't they? And we have to be very careful about doing this. They certainly have a lot of similarities, but they're not dead set similar. They're not the same. We have to account for those differences, okay? Now, we think that they followed the model of the cursus honorum, okay, or the honorum. And we've discussed this in class. Basically, what the cursus honorum is a political ladder where you have to achieve certain positions in this political ladder before you are allowed to move up. And the whole purpose of the cursus honorum is to stop someone from moving up too quickly, to stop someone from gathering too much power all at once. Now, we're not exactly sure as to the influence Rome had on the two cities. We know that there certainly was an influence, but to the extent of which they actually enacted on those, difficult to say. And the influence of each city was not equal. There are disparities or differences between the amount of influence each city could bring to the table. Okay, so first thing that we want to look at here is this idea that we have to remember when we're looking at Pompeii and Herculaneum, and Pompeii in particular, that these are former Italian cities. And what do I mean by that? Well, keep in mind the difference between Italian and Roman during these times is quite a pronounced one, okay? So Italians were generally not considered to be Romans. By the time, the period that we look at, which is 78 AD, they have citizenship, but they are still quite a bit different, okay? It's not the traditional sense of the Italians that we're looking at in contemporary times. Now, the Italian people that settled Pompeii before the Romans really moved in force were the Samnites, okay? And the reason why that's important is because around a couple of years before we look at Pompeii, which is 78 AD, we're looking at about maybe almost a century beforehand, you have what's called the social wars. And what happens here is the Samnite cities and a whole bunch of other Italian cities rise up in rebellion against Rome. They eventually lose the war to Rome and they get a lot of their rights taken away. And Pompeii is turned into a Roman colony, meaning it basically doesn't have that much power. This is also when you get the patron god of Aphrodite established over Pompeii. Now, we know that Pompeii eventually gets a lot of its power back, but up until the point of the eruption, it largely remains a colony, meaning the imperial city of Rome actually has quite a degree of control over it. Herculaneum was not a colony. Okay, now, this doesn't mean that Pompeii has no political power, but it's an important distinction to make. So what did local government look like? Okay, well, you've seen this one before. Okay, this is our lovely little social pyramid. Okay, and this is taken from a couple other different places. And this is the very basic drawdown. Okay, so we start off with our senatorial elite, quickly followed by the local elite, freedmen, women, and slaves. Okay, now you'll see here that there are little things right next to it: freeborn, freedmen, and slaves. Okay, now that means exactly what you think it would mean. Okay, so the senatorial elite and the local elite were people that were born free. They were never in a slaving family. Okay, this put them on the top of the ladder Not because if you were freeborn, you were immediately wealthy and things like that, but because you had to be freeborn to achieve certain positions. So you could not enter the Senate in Rome if you were a free man, someone who'd only just been freed from slavery, okay? Nor could you enter into the local elite at Pompeii or Herculaneum if you were a previous slave. Now, obviously, slaves are not going to be entering into any of these positions, okay? But you have to not be a slave born to enter into these certain positions. Now, keep in mind, when we are talking about the senatorial elite, we are talking about the senatorial elite from Rome. Okay, so keep in mind, Vesuvius, Pompeii, and Herculaneum are very popular tourist destinations for people from Rome. Okay, particularly for the very wealthy senatorial elite class that run the Senate in Rome, and they like going there. And they do have some influence on the local government there, not as much, but some influence. The local elite are the ones who actually run Pompeii and Herculaneum, okay? And they are organised like a Senate, but they are not the Senate. Keep that in mind, and we'll go through that distinction. Freedmen are, of course, former slaves that have been freed through the process of manumission, okay? We are looking at here a very skilled class, usually, because they would have picked up skills as slaves, and they often form the core basis of the workmen or the artisans. Okay, now, just because you're freeborn doesn't mean that you'd automatically end up in this local elite section. It just happens that all freeborn were in the, it just so happens that all local elites were freeborns. So a freeborn person could still be around this little section here, but they're not just counted on this hierarchy for simplicity's sake. Now, women were placed underneath freemen in this social hierarchy. This is where I don't particularly like this social hierarchy table as much, because you do have a distinction. Of course, a local elite freed woman, local elite freeborn woman would be higher than a free man in the social hierarchy. Women are not actually this low on the social hierarchy in Roman social structure. It really depends on who they're married to, who their father is, and what amount of independence they have. So keep in mind, that's a bit of a weird one to put there. And of course, we have slaves on the bottom. Now, when we think of slaves, we often think of the sort of ancient Egyptian slaves where very few rights, that's a horrible, horrible life, everything like that. Not to advocate for Roman slavery, it's not a good thing at all, but slaves are a bit different in Rome. Now, you do have your agricultural slaves, which are just treated terribly, and they are sort of tied to the field, but you also have your in-house slaves and your tutors and things like that, which can actually earn a decent life. Sometimes they are paid, but it's a form of slavery. They cannot leave, even though they are paid. And the slaves are also considered part of family a lot of times. So they're on the bottom to social structure, but it's a strange one. Okay, so the one that we're really focused on when we're doing Pompeii and Herculaneum is this idea of the local elite, okay? And this is what we really want to hit when we're doing the politics of Pompeii and Herculaneum. So what is our local government, and what are our institutions in that local government? Okay, so the local government is of course made out of the local elites. It's not made out of that senatorial elites. Now that senatorial elite does sit higher than the local government, okay? But I want you to think about it this way. It's the same way in that your local councillor for the area of Blacktown relatively has a large amount of power compared to you, okay? And they are going to be responsible for everything that's happening in that area, okay? However, if a federal politician that was representing an entire territory or big area came down to Blacktown, okay, they would have more power in that area. However, they more than likely wouldn't be messing around with the local affairs and things like that. They let the local government and local council deal with that. Okay, so your big parliament politician that sits in Canberra Parliament is your Roman senator in this case. And then your local Blacktown councillor is your local elite here. So let's have a look at the different institutes or the agencies for this local government. Now, we divide the Pompeii and Herculaneum government institutions into 3 different types, okay? Executive, council, and People's Assembly. Now, you can see here that we have a little bit of extra on each, and we're going to go through in PowerPoint a bit more on that, but let's just break it down very simply. So when we're looking at the executive branch, we are effectively looking at the people on the top of the list, the ones that are in charge, the ones who enforce the politics, okay? They execute the will of the parliament or the will of the council. We'll talk about that a bit later, okay? Now, these are divided into 2 groups. The first ones that we have are the Dumviri, okay? And these are effectively the mayors of the town. Now, I did say mayors because there are 2 of them, okay? Like a lot in Roman politics, they often have 2 leaders, so one cannot get all the power for themselves and sort of screw things up. Now, we have evidence of the Dumviri and their political presence in an office of the Dumviri in the southern end of the forum, which we'll have a look at later. The other one that we look at is the aediles, and the aediles have a corresponding or similar position in the Roman structure, okay? You might have seen them when we did the Senate of Rome in year 11. And these are the people basically responsible for bread and games and maintaining public order, okay? So they sit underneath the Dumviri, but they're still part of that little executive branch, okay? And we'll talk about how they fit in there. The office of the aediles is on the southern end of the forum. Now, in the middle, we have the council. Now, the council, easiest way to put that is the parliament, okay? It's the parliament of that local area, okay? And in this little parliament, you have about 80 to 100 leaders of the community, okay? So it's a relatively big group, and this forms the basis of the local elite, okay? So the local elite is largely going to be in this council. Only about 4 of them are going to be in this executive at any given time, because there's 2 Dumviri and 2 aediles. Now, this council for 80 to 100 leaders of the community would meet in the council house on the southern end of the forum, okay? And if you've noticed that this one's in the southern, and this one's in the southern, and this one's in the southern, congratulations, you notice a pattern. We think that the municipal buildings or the administrative buildings were in the southern end of the forum, and they're all grouped together. Now, the last one that we have is the People's Assembly, okay? And these are the people that would vote on council proposals. So the council would put forth a new law, okay? And it would go to the People's Assembly, and they would get to vote on it if it goes forward or has to get sent back to the council to be readjusted, okay? Now, easiest way to explain People's Assembly is it's basically you and I, okay? They're not part of government, but they are voters, the everyday voter, okay? And they get to vote on what comes out from the parliament or the council, okay? And then the executive represents the council. Keep in mind, not everyone in Pompeii and Herculaneum could vote. It was a relatively small pool of people that could actually vote. So it's not exactly like nowadays, but that's a similar way that we can look at it. So let's have a look at this Pompeian Forum. Now, this is a map that you've definitely seen a lot of times, okay? And you can see here, this is what we were talking about before. At this southern end, we have a whole bunch of admin stuff. So these are what's called the municipal offices, okay? Where the Dumvirs, the aediles, and things like that may have sit. This is the comitium. See if you can't see my little mouse pointer going around. And this is the basilica. Basilica has a bit of a stranger role when we're looking at this. We think it had something to do with the executives, but not too sure. We definitely know it functioned as a court of some kind, okay? Okay, so let's have a look at these institutions in a bit more detail, okay? Now, the first one that we're going to look at is the executives or the magistracies, okay? Now, magistracies is the alternative name that we can adjust to the positions that are at the executive level. And let's have a look at what that means, okay? Because it's important to remember that they can be called both. When looking at the executives, we are looking at these people who are effectively looking at those who execute the will of the city council, hence they're called executives, okay, because they execute the will. The jobs these executives do are called magistracies, okay? So you have the executive position, and we know that there's two jobs associated with the executive position, the Duumviri and the aediles. Now, those jobs are called magistracies, and the people that hold those jobs collectively are known as magistrates. So if a person is a Duumviri, they are a magistrate because they hold the magistracy of a Duumviri. If they are an aedile, okay, they are also a magistrate because they hold the magistracy of aedile. Okay. Now, there are two magistracies, my apologies, jobs that are held by executives. In Pompeii, they're held by 4 magistrates for 1 year. So the first one are the Duumviri, okay, or the Duumviri, depending if it's plural or not. These are effectively the mayors of the town. There are 2 of them, so no one has too much power, and they implement the laws agreed to by the city council. Once they finish their term, they would join the city council. And this is a very common Roman way of ruling. Okay, so basically, you don't get to be part of the city council until you have enacted yourself as a Duumviri or Duumvir. Okay, so all of the council, and we'll look at how that runs in a bit, are run by former Duumvirs. Now, the other one that we look at is aediles, and these are the junior magistrates. So they are certainly underneath the Duumvir, who are responsible for the administration of sacred and public buildings. So they look after the temples, but they also look after the streets and so forth. The administration of public works, make sure everything works. Sponsorship of spectacles, so they make sure that they organise the games, which are very important in Rome. And the maintenance of public order. If you get out of line, an aedile is going to sort you out. A man had to have served the term as an aedile before he could stand for Duumvir. So you had to serve as one of these guys before you could even attempt to get elected as a Duumvir. Now, every 5 years, we get a special magistracy that comes down called the quinquennial Duumviri. Okay, so it only happens every 5 years, and they act as a censor and cleaned up the city council of anyone that should not be on it. Okay, so basically these guys were looking after the moral stability of the town, and they would go through the list of people who were on the city council, and they would look at their actions in the past 5 years, and also whether they had the wealth to still be on that council, be considered for it, and if they did something really horrible, or they didn't have the wealth required, they would get rid of them and they would no longer be on the council. Okay, it's a pretty powerful position because you have the power to get rid of people from the city council, but you have to justify it. So the next one that we look at is the council. Okay, now the council is also called the Ordo Decurionum, okay, which literally means in English, the order of leaders. Can also be called a curia, which is the gathering of men. A member of the council was called a decurione or a curialis. Okay, so if you're a member of the council, you're a decurione, but the council itself is called the Ordo Decurionum. Now, this was the legislative body of the city, and I want you to keep in mind, whenever you see legislative, it means the group of people who make the laws. Okay, they legislate, they make law, who debated with each other to construct the laws which would govern the city and how to administer it. So these guys would put forth the law, what the law is going to be, okay? And then the Duumviri, or the executives, would enact the law to make sure it was followed. It was comprised of 100 men who had a lifetime membership, and they had to be freeborn, okay? No former slaves, doesn't matter how rich you are. They had to be respectable, so that means innkeepers, artists, and prostitutes, or any other job that the Romans considered as dirty, and of a certain level of wealth, okay? Because only politicians So only wealthy people could be politicians. You don't want poor people in there because they're going to start acting in their own interests, and that's not what the politicians want. Now, this is usually formed by former executives, Dulviri, and those picked by the Dulviri to fill any gaps. The reason why you sometimes have Dumvirs or Dulviri picking people to fill in those gaps is because it's actually very hard to maintain that 100 people only using people that used to be Dumviri. Okay, so every once in a while, a Dumvir would basically just go, we've got about 15 seats empty. This needs to be about 80 or 100 people. So I'm going to put out a list of respectable people, and these people are going to go onto the council to make sure it's full. No, they haven't serviced Dumvir, but I'm basically vouching for them. And if there was too many, that's what the job of the census is for. They're going to start cutting out people. Now, the last one is known as the Comitium. Okay. Now, this is also known as the People's Assembly, and it comprised all male citizens over the age of 25. This includes freedmen, but they could not be voted into office. Okay, so freedmen could vote, but they could never be voted for. They can never go into an office. They voted for the years of magistrates, as well as for the years magistrates. So they would vote who's going to be the Aedile and who's going to be the Dumvir, as well as proposals put forward by the council. However, they're not that powerful. The council could overrule them. Now, we think that these people voted by precincts or guilds. Okay, so basically what would happen is they would divide up the city, and each city block that we think it might have been precinct would vote. Whoever won the majority in that precinct would get one vote from that precinct, and it would go through all of those times. Guilds like the Fullers Guild, significant economic institutions could also get a vote because the council recognised them as basically, you're very important, you need a vote. Now, a good question that we can ask is, how did Rome influence the cities? So the extent of Rome's influence on Pompeii and Herculaneum has been debated by historians for quite some time. Okay, we're still relatively unsure about how much impact they actually had on it. And as we'll talk about at the start, it was formerly a colony, at least Pompeii was, but sort of the aspect in which it finally moved away from colony is a bit iffy. Okay, it seems that Rome, particularly during the early imperial period, did hold ultimate control over the city's politics, but granted them large amounts of autonomy. So what that's saying is Rome could step in whenever they wanted to, okay? Whatever Rome said, Pompeii had to do, okay? However, they often chose not to, because they realised that they wanted autonomy, they wanted to grant the cities the ability to do whatever they want, to run themselves, because if they try and run everything themselves, it's a lot of paperwork, it's impossible to administrate from all the way in Rome, but also you're eventually going to annoy a lot of people and they're going to get uprisings. So easier just to let them run themselves and know that at any given time we can step in. So how do we know that they could intervene? Well, we have our lovely quote here from Tacitus, and you might have heard this one before. So about this time, AD 59, so about 20 years before the eruption, there was a serious fight between the inhabitants of two Roman settlements, Nuceria and Pompeii. It arose out of a trifling incident at a gladiatorial show. This led to stone throwing, and then swords were drawn. The people of Pompeii, where the show was held, came off best. Basically, the people of Pompeii kicked the butts of the people from Nuceria after a gladiatorial game. Many wounded and mutilated Nucerians were taken to the capital, so they took themselves to Rome. The emperor, who was Nero at the time, instructed the Senate to investigate the affair. The Senate passed it to the consuls. When they reported back, the Senate debarred Pompeii from holding any similar gatherings for 10 years. Illegal associations in the town were dissolved, and the sponsor of the show and his fellow instigators of the disorders were exiled. Okay, so Rome basically steps in and goes, right, you've been naughty, you've been horrible, you've hurt these Nucerians, you started that fight. As punishment, you're not allowed to hold any gladiatorial games for 10 years. okay, which is a big thing in Rome. They needed the gladiatorial games, okay, and then we're also going to exile some of your politicians that started. So they just stepped in and did that. They didn't need to really consult with Pompey. So the emperor does hold a massive amount of power over Pompeii and Herculaneum. Okay, so in short, Rome could intervene in Vesuvian affairs at will, but they chose not to most of the time. Now, it does say that it stopped for 10 years. We know that not all the games stopped, and we think just large-scale ones, okay? And we think it didn't even last 10 years. It probably only lasted a couple of years, and then the emperor sort of went, just let them have it. So how did Rome influence the cities still? Okay, so it was part of the Republican/Imperial Senate in Rome. So there was a lot of people that actually came from the Vesuvian region in Pompeii and Herculaneum that actually played a part in Roman politics inside the Roman Senate. Okay, so not every Roman senator came from Rome itself. Often there was a number of senators who actually came from the Italian peninsula. Okay, so these people may have originally come from the Vesuvian region, or senators in Rome chose to establish holiday residences in Pompeii and Herculaneum due to its location. So the most famous senator to come from the Vesuvian region is, of course, Marcus Tullius Cicero. He was an incredibly famous senator who stated it was harder to get a seat on the Pompeian City Council than a Senate in Rome. So that's a lovely little quote, and it tells us just how difficult and cutthroat Pompeian politics were. He managed to get a seat on the Roman Senate that governed the empire, but found it really, really hard to get a seat on the Pompei City Council. So what we're going to look at now is we're going to look at the buildings that show the government, okay? And we've got a lovely thing called Planet Pompeii, and we're going to look at the Basilica, the Comitium, and the Curia. Now, what I will do is I'll just check if I've got the right thing screen sharing at the moment. So just give me a second. Okay, so we should be on the right thing. So let's have a look, okay? So at here, and you can see this is our lovely little forum, okay? Nice little satellite view. We have in the lower corner here, the Basilica, okay? Now, what is the importance of the Basilica to local politics? Well, we think this is where the executives may have actually sat in judgment for the city of Pompeii. Okay, so you might have had a Delvir or an Aedile here who would act as judges in the local courts. Now, I want you to keep in mind, this one is a bit debatable. We think that they acted like this because there's a slight bit of an incline in the Basilica where we think a judge would have sat so he could overlook the people in the court. Okay. The Basilica is definitely some sort of legal building, but the role that the executive actually played in that legal establishment is a bit shaky, okay? Now, the one that we have in the middle here, okay, is the municipal buildings, and hopefully I can click on it because it doesn't seem to want to. Hold on a second. Well, that's just rude. Okay, good. Yes, that's what I wanted. Okay, so this is our municipal buildings, okay? And these are the three little buildings that sit on the southern edge of the forum, okay? And this is where we think a lot of the local government did their admin. We also think that this one in particular, the one on the right-hand side here, is the one that was the city council chambers. So this is where all the city council members would sit and have their debates and arguments and decide on new laws of the city. It makes sense for all the municipal buildings to be close together in the forum because we know that the forum was the key space in Pompeii. Okay, it's where all of their commerce, or a lot of their commerce got done, but also their political and religious affairs. Okay, so it makes sense for the orders chambers to be there, and also next to these municipal buildings, which might have also sorted through a lot of the admin stuff for them. Now you can see here in this little square space here, this is the Comitium. You can see a nice little picture of it. So you can see it's not that big. Okay, it's a small square where people would meet and they would vote on who's going to be the next magistrates and whether the city council's new law should be overpassed. Okay, and by the fact that it's small, you can tell that there's not many people in Pompeii who are actually able to vote. So it was relatively limited affair, and I want you to keep that in mind. But the large thing that I want you to keep in mind is this southern section of the forum. Okay, remember the buildings that are here. Remember the links that they have to local government and be able to call upon them in an examination. All right, so I do believe that's the last of our little Pompeii politics here. So what we'll do is we will stop it there, okay? And I will put out another one that you can watch that's going to go through these things in a bit more detail. All right, have a lovely day, and I will see you again another time.